Okay, so we have the last panel of the day, and what is, of course, a very short day, and tomorrow will be, the first march continues. So I'd like to introduce Bilge Erten, who has written a paper with Joe Stiglitz and Verhoogen. So this is the organizing committee on stage and at some level, or parts of it. Anyway, Bilge is going to present sort of a conventional paper presentation like the others for a half an hour. Then we will sort of move seamlessly into the panel where Joel Michaels and Franklin Keller will come up, and then the authors will come up, and we'll sort of have an hour discussion about the CHIPS Act and more generally. So, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Pleasure to be here. So this is a paper with Joe and Eric, but I would like to also acknowledge great work by our pre-docs over there, our research assistants, Victor and Max. Their work on this project has really made it shine. So thank you, guys. So in this project, we're looking at the labor market effects of the CHIPS Act. And let me just say that, in the US, industrial policy has always been there, but kind of under the rubric of Defense Department spending and Energy Department, and through programs like ARPA and DARPA, it was ongoing for a long time. But under the Biden administration, it became much more prominent with an explicit goal towards reviving manufacturing sector in the United States. And in case of the CHIPS Act, particularly the semiconductors and kind of the broader chips and how that sector supports AI development and so on. So in this paper, we cover a lot of background in the paper if you're interested in how the act was motivated. So one of the primary motivations was national security. And in fact, that if the US falls behind in the development of cutting-edge chips and semiconductors, it will come at the cost of losing advantage to major international competitors, and that can have serious consequences. Thank you. That has particularly become more evident since the pandemic, when we realized that the supply chain interruptions can cause really major issues in terms of how we can manufacture semiconductors in the US. And the other motivation, of course, was that we want to create good, well-paying jobs, and especially in the high-tech sector, and we want to do it in manufacturing as well. And of course, semiconductors is a major sector, and US wanted to be an important player in that. So we focus on employment because there's not much evidence about, did this act in fact produce any employment? Did it affect wages? Did it affect how firms create expectations about when and why they want to hire? And it's politically salient because we want to know both now, the short-term effects, but also in the future, did the employment effects, in fact, last in the future? So in this paper, we will focus on very short-term effects, but I think there is more that can be done in a few years from now when we know, for example, when we have data from firms specifically about how much they hired and what other decisions they made in response to this act. So it's a bit of an unusual paper because there is actually lots of effort that went into trying to evaluate the act very quickly. And we have some data constraints. So the data constraint particularly is that we don't have microdata on the plants for a couple of years. So they come out with about 2 years of lag. For example, annual census of manufacturing firms, which would be a great data set to use. We don't have it, it's gonna come in a couple of years. But the nice thing about it is we have employment data. In particular, we have quarterly census on employment and wages, and we are gonna use that until 2025, quarter one. And the first finalized CHIPS award actually happened in November 2024, but the CHIPS Act itself was actually passed in August 2022. Okay? So in the longer run, we would like to actually compare firms that got the final awards with the firms that got only the preliminary memorandum of terms and no awards to make it a bit more comparable in terms of treatment control group. Currently, we are going to do a county-level difference in difference analysis where we're going to look at counties with semiconductor facilities, right? We have that data, I'm gonna talk about that, versus counties with high-tech employment but no semiconductor facilities. So these are also kind of comparable because given that semiconductors is another high-tech sector, we thought this would be a good comparison group. The other option is to take just semiconductors, but divided into two, where the first group, the treatment group, would be those with a fabrication facility. We call them fab counties. And the counties with the other control group would be counties with semiconductor facilities, but no fabrication units. So because a big part of the grant, the act was giving grants to fabrication units and production units in particular, the second one essentially isolates within the semiconductor industry the ones that are directly treated versus the ones that are not as treated. So we have those two strategies. I'm going to talk more about that as well. Yep. Yep, so there are facilities that are just for design purposes, so or like R&D purposes, and those would be a non-fab facility.
What about ATL? Just packaging,
That's not right, yeah.
No. That's not fab.
That's not.
Yeah, but I thought that's where a lot of them are going.
So fabrication is like basically the actual production of the chip. Yeah, that's where most of the money went. Right. So currently, no awards are. So only one award, according to the data set, was you finalized, and they stopped publishing that data. So we actually currently don't know exactly how many firms got the award. Don't know. Yeah. Was there a question? Yeah. Go ahead.
So when you talk about employment, I read in the news that there are a lot of relocation from Taiwan. So the employment here there's local employment or including also the relocations from Taiwan?
Yep, so we will have Taiwanese firms like TSMC in the data set. Yeah.
So it's
So
all included, the employment
Yeah,
includes
so
international
basically,
immigrants?
yes, because it's by residence, so the data includes foreign firms as well.
Okay.
Correct.
Can I ask you, so two questions. What is I mean, maybe it doesn't matter for what you were doing, but isn't it the case that most of the money has not gone up?
Right.
With the exception of the equity investment in Intel? Does that?
Yep.
So, but then what you want to measure is just the award, even if the money has.
So what we are measuring is, and in fact, I will show you what we're finding is that firms actually start reacting much before they get the award. And we are going to document that very clearly. So what we see is a very big anticipation effect. And this is similar to the literature about like other defense spending. So Raimi has a paper about, there's a bunch of other papers that did that for other types of defense spending in the US. And they always find that firms start investing before actually they get the money. Yeah. Because, and we're going to hear from the commentators that in fact, it takes a long process. But the firms kind of get confident that they will eventually get it. It's still a negotiation. It takes 5-6 months until they get it. But they kind of know they will likely get it, given the market structure.
The second question is, maybe this is, I guess that's sort of a hostile question, but I'll put it this way. Isn't this like a really weak null hypothesis? Like in the sense that if I give you $53 billion to dig a ditch and fill the ditch back up, you are going to find employment effects. You're going to find employment, but that's sort of not the question. Right? Or are you going to say that really what I want to know is whether if I hand out $52 billion in cash, there are going to be some jobs?
Right. Yes. So we will actually see at the 6-digit level, what will happen in a given county in a given quarter. So we will be able to differentiate, for example, the workers that dig these holes, right, versus the ones that actually do the semiconductor production.
But the question
and
is,
so on.
Is this really the question that we want to know? Like, I'll put it.
Right.
Or what's the goal of the CHIPS Act?
Right. So as I said, the goal actually the CHIPS Act had many goals, right? And Arguably, you can say employment wasn't the number one goal. The number one goal is really catch up with the rival producers and make sure that we produce the cutting-edge chips in this country for also the resilience reasons, right? Because if there's how about another shock hits, we have also this trade war going on, right? So it's basically to kind of ensure US against future shocks that might be happening and to become self-resilient, right? So within that, we still think it's important to understand the employment effects because we don't know, did it actually create employment? Did it actually jumpstart the semiconductor production here at a level that was much lower before? So that's the goal of the project. Okay? Yes?
Definitely, we shouldn't end here, the analysis of the CHIPS Act. This is the thing that we can do now, a few months after it's happened, right? But eventually, you also want to look at output and productivity and spillover, learning by doing all those things. We would never say this is a job.
Exactly. And I mean, we make a point in the paper that this should be just starting point. As more data comes out, we definitely need to understand, like, did it have spillover effects? Did it actually increase productivity? Did it have, like, tangible effects at the firm level? Someone should write that paper. Please write it. So what we show in the paper is that these anticipation effects, as I was saying, start with the precursor of the bill, which is the US Innovation and Competition Act. And as soon as it's kind of announced, actually, in the Senate, we see employment increasing in the semiconductor sector. And there was actually bipartisan support for this act from very early on, and it passes with a very big majority in the Senate. That shows that there is, overall not much opposition, that it's likely to pass in the House as well. And what we find is that there is robust employment effects in the semiconductor sector. So per affected county, the effects are about 110 to 180 jobs, and that varies based on basically the identification strategy. But it's very robust across different estimation methods. We also see very robust effects on the non-residential construction. So it's not just, as we were saying, in the production of semiconductors, but also actual construction, because lots of it went to construction. And you can see, in fact, the jobs created in the construction sector are actually higher than just the semiconductors themselves. And the back of the envelope calculations show a direct effect of about 15,000 to 16,000 jobs, and the indirect effect in these other sectors that get stimulated, like construction, of about 28 to 35,000 jobs. This is, as we say, it's not enormous relative to the $52.7 billion that was spent on the act, but larger than many people have expected because it's a very capital-intensive sector. Okay? So just a little bit of background. So in terms of components of the act, so $39 billion was allocated to be spent on direct subsidies for production of semiconductors and also related equipment and materials. $11 billion was allocated for research and development, and the act also included a 25% investment tax credit, and the Trump's Big Beautiful Bill increased this to 35% in July 2025. So in terms of the timing, the bill actually has a long history. So the first kind of bills that were introduced were in May and June 2020. The first one was called Endless Frontiers, and the second one is the Chips for America's Acts. And then these two bills, they were actually merged into one and introduced in the Senate in May 18, 2021. So I'm talking about these dates because we will actually do some analysis around these dates to look at the stock market reaction to these specific days where the act comes into play. And I will show you that actually introduction of the bill in May 18 really mattered in terms of stock market reaction. Later, it gets passed in June, right? As I was saying, there were 19 Republican votes in support of the bill. So it's a very big majority. And then later, there's America Competes Act passes the House, but you see the CHIPS Act passage is roughly 1 year after the USICA passage. So the CHIPS actually comes much later. It first passes the Senate and then the House, I'll show you also event studies around that time. And later it gets signed by Biden in August. And what we see in the data set is that November 15 is actually 2024 is the first major CHIPS award finalized. So the finalization of the award comes much later, but we can also see like there were preliminary memorandum of terms, like initial contracts that get signed by many firms in the meantime. Okay, so here we have one of our descriptive graphs. So you can see this is from the current employment statistics. You can see like for the semiconductor employment, we see more or less constant trend. And then the US Innovation and Competition Act passes the Senate. And in fact, the introduction happens in May, right at this point. And after that, you see a big jump in the semiconductor employment. And after CHIPS Act passes at the national trend, you don't see much. And we see kind of collapse after Biden drops out and then the Trump election again. Okay, so here's the stock market reaction. So we're looking at cumulative abnormal returns here. And the first one is the introduction of the US Innovation and Competition Act. And you can see one day after the bill was introduced, for these 21 semiconductor firms that have production facilities, you see a big jump in terms of the stock market reaction. But we don't see the same when the same bill gets passed in the Senate or when the CHIPS gets passed in the House. Okay, so it seems like the first introduction of the bill was really important in terms of moving expectations about how the sector is going to do in the future. Okay, so we have some more background in the paper where, yep, so those questions.
Just a tiny question. Do you know how do you have a back of the envelope for what that means in terms of market cap or the magnitude of this? The first one? And I guess it doesn't mean revert either. Maybe it does eventually mean revert, but...
It doesn't last that long, I think.
Yeah,
but that's a good question. We didn't check that. We can check that. Okay, so in terms of companies' responses, so Global Foundries, for example, they held a press conference in July 2021. So this is just a few months after USICA was introduced. And in that, the CEO told CNBC that they believe that economies of scale and ability to bring capacity online quicker, it's better to expand existing facilities. And that's an important point for us because it's not that easy to jumpstart a semiconductor facility. It takes 2 to 3 years of investment, and it's quite a time-wise long event. So, but what happened most likely is that in the existing facilities, they expanded capacity. And in this case, for example, they hired 1,000 workers, and they invested $1 billion in Malta, New York. And of course, there was the whole chips shortage that happened right after COVID. But what we see is that until the USICA was introduced, there was actually no sharp movement in employment whatsoever. I showed you that graph, and it only comes with a 5-6 months lag. Okay, so some more anecdotal evidence. So this is another company, a smaller company called Skywater Technology. This is from its CEO, saying that as the country is coalescing around the concept of semiconductor sovereignty, Skywater plays an increasingly critical role in supporting the vision of reestablishing the US as a technology manufacturing leader. The CHIPS Act received bipartisan support in the Senate, and we remain confident that it will ultimately become law. Skywater will make a lot of money off of the mere fact that there's going to be more innovation, more investment going into R&D. We are talking with the state of Minnesota, both the executive branch and the senators and representatives from the US government, in terms of how we can accelerate adding capacity into our Minnesota fab so that we can resolve some of these near-term supply constraints. So as we're going to also discuss in the panel, one of the conditions was that they already received funding from the state or the city. And this was sort of the first step through which then they can also get funding from the federal government. And here the CEO is essentially talking about how they're trying to establish that contract for Minnesota. And at the same time as they were saying this, they just added 100 jobs to their Bloomington, Minnesota site. So it seems like from the accounts that we see from the press, there are many that show that industry employment plans actually significantly changed after the passage of the act. Okay, so I think I mentioned that we are using quarterly census of employment and wages, okay, QCEW. So this is getting data from unemployment systems. And we're going to look at 60-digit industry, county, quarter level. We have some robustness for 4-digit level as well. So they have some suppression of the data. Basically, when it becomes a very low figure, then to preserve confidentiality, they may not release it, so it will appear as missing. So in the baseline, we just imputed zeros for missings. In the robustness, we dropped the missings and just work with the existing data. And actually, in the second case, we get even bigger effects. And we have also the Semiconductor Industry Association ecosystem map. So according to this map, we know location of all the facilities. And as I was saying, we know production, design, and R&D. So we are mostly working with the production facilities to identify treated counties. We have also some additional data sets for robustness. Sorry, which one?
Code that you're using, is that just manufacturing, or does it include NVIDIA and AMD, with like essentially the main US companies which don't do manufacturing?
The semiconductor industry, you mean the 6-digit category?
Yeah, so that code,
yes. So that
is it only manufacturing, or is it just, or is it semiconductors more broadly?
Semiconductors broadly.
Yes.
Yeah.
R&D employees, right, will be most likely be in.
So the NVIDIAs and the AMDs
Yeah.
and the Qualcomms, they will all be there.
Yes, so in identification, we are using mostly the location of the production facilities, but when we are measuring employment, we are adding in design and R&D and the manufacturing workers all together.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, so these are the two differences in different strategies. So the treated group in the first category are counties with the non-university production facilities. The control, and that's about 149 counties, right? So the control counties is much bigger, about 752. And here we're looking at counties that have greater than 100 employed workers in the 11 4-digit sectors that the US Census Bureau identifies as high-tech. Okay? And I'll show you the map in a second. The second one compares treated counties with the fabrication facility versus those that don't have a fabrication facility but have semiconductor production. So that's roughly 82 versus 66. So that's like within the semiconductors that are more treated versus less. Okay, so here, the red ones are the high-tech counties that are in our control group in the first design. The summation of the blue and the green, that are our treated counties in the first design, right? So basically, having any semiconductor facility can be considered as an intent to treat design, where we are comparing against counties that don't have those facilities, but they have other high-tech production. And in the second design, we are basically comparing those that have fabrication facilities, which are the green ones, and to those that don't have, which are blue. So in that one, we are looking within semiconductors, those that have a fabrication unit, and to those that don't have. Okay, so specifications are very straightforward. So we have first a simple diff and diff that's very transparent. So we're looking at treated counties in the post period, adding the county fixed effects and quarter year fixed effects. We have an event study version of the same. We also have a synthetic difference in differences that matches treatment and control trajectories flexibly over time and creates a better fit in terms of parallel trends. So the key assumption here in both cases is that treatment and control follows parallel trends in the absence of the treatment shock. So in this case, we're going to look at both the timing of USICA and the timing of CHIPS Act. Okay, so we can see that this is the simple definitive. We can see semiconductor employment sharply increasing after the USICA passes the Senate. So that's, again, the precursor bill of the CHIPS. And you can see that after CHIPS Act is signed, the employment level stays very elevated in the treated counties relative to control, but there is not much of a further increase after the CHIPS Act passage. And we can also see parallel trends throughout. In the fab versus fabless design, we also see quite similar parallel trends, and again, an increase in employment. One thing I want to highlight is the scales are quite different. So this goes from 0 to 300, so treatment effect around 106 jobs on average per county, versus here, this goes up to, scale is up to 600, so this is about 190 jobs created on average county. And the fab versus fabless also shows similar post-CHIPS, not much effect, but employment remains elevated, and most of the action is happening before CHIPS Act happens. Okay, so this is just in the table form. So the first column is what I showed you in the graphs. Second column is semiconductor employment and materials. So these are two additional 6-digit categories. So these are basically can think of as like very important inputs into semiconductors. And we also see increases in those in terms of their employment. And the third column is summing up columns 1 and 2. And overall, that's also increasing. Okay, so this is our synthetic definitive. It's very similar, but you can see again that the parallel trends is, by assumption, it's imposed over here. And we can see very sharp increase in this case as well. And this is the fab versus fabless with the synthetic definitive. And again, we see a very similar pattern. And these are the synthetic definitive results. So in terms of numbers, they're very similar. So in the simple DID, it was 206. Here's 110. In the simple DID, it was 191. Here's 180. So overall, these numbers are quite similar. In terms of precision, the second category is not as precise here. Okay, here is the non-residential construction effects. So we can see, again, more or less parallel trends before USICA passes the Senate, and then a sharp increase that actually continues after the CHIPS Act was signed. And we also see similar with the synthetic DID, similar increase with the fab versus fabless. And in terms of effect sizes, these are even bigger than the effects we see for semiconductor only. That's here. So second column, so it's like 135 jobs per county, or if you look at fab versus fabless, 202. So we also looked at other inputs. There, the results are not as robust based on different designs. So in the first design, we see some increase, but we don't see that in the second design. That's why we don't overinterpret that effect. And total county employment, it seems like there's actually some increase in the total county employment for fab counties. Okay? We see that. And in terms of county GDP, it's not precise, but again, for fab counties, maybe there's some effect, and it's too early to tell. Here, we don't have much data because it's annual data sets, so we don't have enough power to detect that. But in terms of wages, so the first design shows some evidence of treatment effect for wages. But when we compare fab versus fabless, so we lose some precision, so we also don't overinterpret these results. Okay, so I showed this already. So just a brief discussion, and I will conclude. I have two slides, so I think I can do it in 2 minutes. Okay, so we have some discussion about the aggregation in the paper. So basically, this is a point about, this was initially paper that we did for the Brookings Institute, and for mostly macroeconomists, and they said, well, you have to be careful because you're missing the intercept here. And when we think about the missing intercept problem, of course, the only way to get around it is to estimate a structural model, which is beyond the scope of our paper. But we did some calculations to think about if we scale up the difference in difference estimate, what does that mean relative to the aggregate effect? So in our case, the counties that I treated are actually really small compared to the macroeconomy. The labor mobility between these counties are actually likely to be small, and the CHIPS funding is also small relative to the macroeconomy. So all of these suggest actually that the scale-up effect that we estimate, which is around 15 to 16,000 jobs that's created, is actually quite similar to the raw time series, which is 18,000 increase. So roughly speaking, we actually approximate pretty well to the aggregate effect. And just to conclude, so in terms of the main findings, so we find this strong anticipation effect of the implementation of the CHIPS Act that starts from the precursor bill. We show strong positive effects on the semiconductor employment and some spillover effects to non-residential construction. And in terms of employment effects, like I was saying, direct effect of 15 to 16,000 jobs, indirect for about 28 to 35,000 jobs, depending on which approach we use. But as we were saying in the beginning, we definitely need more research. We need firm data to measure output, productivity, profits, and how those outcomes vary in the long run. We want to know long-term effects, so we need to wait, unfortunately, until that data becomes available in 2 years' time. We also have a lengthy discussion about design of industrial policy, and I don't have much time to get into it. Hopefully, we can cover in the discussion. So, specifically thinking about targeted subsidies versus tax credits, right? Which tool is more beneficial, and what are the trade-offs in using different tools? And how can government claim part of the upside, right? We always we are there when the part of the firms fail, government absorb the losses. When firms succeed, we don't absorb the gains. So what are some of the tools to do that? And also, should social policy be embedded in the industrial policy? Because CHIPS Act came with childcare policies, good wages, and other good labor practices. It came as a bundle. So it's a question of, do we need to have that, or should that actually be a more generalized policy? Thank you.